Coming to you live from Studio One at Broadcast Forum in New Rochelle, New York. This is the voice of Westchester, 1460 WVOX.
Stay tuned now for Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome to Westchester Eye on the Radio. I'm Peter Moses and my co-host Ardina Seward. John Sharan is off today. He's on a secret mission in New Jersey, but I'll let you in on a little secret. He went to get a part for his lawnmower.
That's what he told you.
That's how important our show was to him today. But the show is important to Ardina and me, is it not?
It certainly is.
How are you doing today?
I am great because our guest is Mike Kimelman, and he's going to give us an education about
I think we should call him Michael.
a lot of things.
I think we should call him Michael.
Why? Did he ask
Michael
to be called Michael?
Well, he said he would call him both, but he introduced himself as Michael. Anyway, for those of you who don't remember, Michael Kimelman spent some time in the news. It wasn't for winning elective office. It wasn't for winning the lottery. It was for insider trading. And before we went on air, we were talking about what are crimes and what are victimless crimes. And one of the things that, by the way, Michael, welcome to the show. You got to speak close to the mic in order to be heard.
Thank you, guys. Good to be here.
Closer, even. Okay. So we were discussing before we went on air the difference between a crime with victims and a victimless crime. How is it that you define insider trading as a victimless crime?
It's a traditional victimless crime. It's not in the sense of Madoff is a good example, and people conflict the two. So in Madoff's case, he stole money from people who had given him money to invest. Those money who had delivered him money and trusted him with their life savings, he had a fiduciary duty to them. They didn't get that money back. So they were clear victims who lost money. In insider trading, it's a little bit different. There's no traditional victim. Because if you think about it, if somebody buys a stock on insider knowledge, defined insider trading, the person who owns the stock still makes money. The stock goes up. So it's a different calculus, and that's why when they calculate the sentence, they don't go by the traditional federal sentencing guidelines of loss and calculating losses. They flip it and calculate your gains. But there's not a traditional victim. That doesn't mean there's no victims. There are arguments out there, academic and otherwise, that the market is a victim of people who, unfairly use insider knowledge to profit. But it's not a person.
Now, you were in the stock industry, but before that, you were a lawyer for a white shoes law firm in Manhattan, Sullivan and Cromwell. And what made you switch from the law to the financial world?
I didn't like the white shoes. I liked the brown, the blacks, everything else. But no, in all seriousness, it was the late 90s. As anybody who has worked for one of the big law firms knows, it is a very serious job where you work a lot of hours. It's not always the most rewarding work. I'm not saying for everybody that was the case. For me, it was. And in the late 90s, I had a lot of friends who were either in the finance industry or the technology industry, working half as much as I was doing a lot more interesting things and making more money doing it. So I figured it was a good time to lateral elsewhere.
And you had no problem making that move?
I didn't. Some people did. I mean, I had always been fascinated by the stock market. I actually traded in law school and did very well in law school. And I was one of the few guys at Sullivan and Cromwell who bothered our compliance officer to the point where they almost had to change the rules because I was trading so much at Sullivan and Cromwell and trying to, obviously use my knowledge, not insider knowledge, but knowledge of the markets to make money. And it just felt like it was a right switch for me at the time. Looking back, do you regret now leaving the law? I mean, it may have been more boring, but it was less challenging in terms of making smart decisions. It's an impossible question to some degree. With perfect 20/20 hindsight, I probably would have preferred not to go to prison. And if that was one of the steps that led me there, then perhaps yes. But there was 100 forks in the road before, I ended up where I ended up. So I didn't regret and don't regret leaving the law. If I was going to go to law school again, and I talked to a lot of kids coming out of college who are considering grad school and whatnot. And I think it's an important decision to make. If you're going to go to law school, it's not like it was in the old days where you were more or less guaranteed a job and some security. It's a lot tougher these days, but it's important to pick an area of the law that's also rewarding and intellectually, fulfilling. So
where do you end up in a circumstance where you're talking to people who are at this crossroads for making a decision? Are you reaching out in the community? Or is it part of your parole?
It's something I do on my own. I have various businesses now, so we either hire interns, and I'll staff interns from my former alma maters, or speak to people. And then there's just general friends, have kids now at the age, unfortunately we're all getting up there in years, who are going to college and then potentially grad school. So I speak to them and other kids.
Well, we're going to be going to break. When we come back, we're going to be speaking some more with Michael Kimelman, who's written a book about his experiences as an insider trader, and I'm sure the book touches on many other subjects, not totally identifying with the crime that he was convicted of committing. This is Westchester Eye on the radio on WVOX and WVOX.com. Pull out your pens and pencils. When we come back, we're going to tell you how to find the book, where to buy it, and how much it costs. We'll be right back after these words and a Fox News break and a Fox Business break as well. Long break.
Somebody's going to blab it on WVOX. There's always something happening at 1460 on the radio. The voice of the people, where many different voices are heard in the land.
WVOX. Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to Westchester Eye on the radio. I'm Peter Moses with Ardina Seward. Our guest today is Michael Kimelman, who is a recent author. Michael Kimelman was convicted of insider trading. And tell us the name of your book and how people can get a hold of it. And if you I know you have your own website, so can you tell us what the website is?
Sure. The book is Confessions of a Wall Street Insider, and it's subtitled A Cautionary Tale of Rats, Feds, and Banksters. And the book's available anywhere you would buy books. So Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, independent bookstores. And you can
Vinny
go to
at the corner?
Yeah. And
Vinny at the corner. Okay.
Absolutely. He'll have a copy.
Yeah.
And the website is www.michaelkimelman.com. Or
Kimelman has one M.
Correct.
Many times it has two, but yours has, you're missing an M.
I know. Years ago, somebody took it.
They took it. What'd they do with it?
Hid it somewhere.
All right, so Ardina, you must have some questions. I
have a million questions. It must have been culture shock. What was it like your first day in prison?
To go away?
Yeah.
So, as I write in the book, I was definitely a deer in headlights and sort of walking around on, the campus, so to speak. And another white inmate came up to me who was laughing, and he basically said, "Hey, did your lawyer lie to you too and tell you this was a white-collar camp?" And, that sort of sums up a lot of it. So I know people have a perception now that there is a club fed or there are white-collar camps. They really don't exist anymore. 60 Minutes did an expose not that long ago, and they got rid of anything that resembled that to some degree.
You mean Miramar in Florida is no longer a
Pensacola
nice
and some of these other places. There are places that are not as bad as other places. Obviously, there are different security levels. So I was in a minimum security place that's designated as a camp is the nickname. And then you go up to a low or a medium or a pen. And sometimes in a low, but definitely in a medium and a pen, you start to get raped and other awful activities take
Michael,
place.
we have a caller.
Right.
Caller, can you tell us your first name, please?
Oh, yes, this is Woody.
Okay, Scott.
I'd like to know
Scott, we're going to cut you off. Thanks for calling. That's my friend Scott Salem, who works at Fox News, and We had to cut him off because he's not a real caller, but he is a good friend.
Okay.
Anyway, you were saying.
I was just saying that it doesn't exist. There are no nice prisons anymore. It's an awful place. I've described it as barbaric, and I can give you as many details or as little as you want, but it's generally a place you wouldn't wish on anybody.
What was the worst part?
The worst part for me, obviously, was being away from my family. I was 40 years old or so when I reported. I had 3 young kids, a wife, family, and friends. To be away from them for an extended period of time is heartbreaking. If I had been a 24-year-old kid that had nothing, it would have been a horrible experience, but it wouldn't have been, 1/3 as bad.
What happened? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did you, which brings me back to another question. What got you there, and did you feel unjustifiably convicted?
I did. I was convicted of a count of insider trading. I can tell you it was in one stock I was charged 3Com, and I can tell you in the clearest possible terms that I didn't insider trade in 3Com. We had, and it's a much longer discussion. I don't know how we are on time, but our case was at the height of the financial crisis. We were tried, 500 yards down the block from Zuccotti Park during the height of Occupy Wall Street. We had a judge who, in retrospect, was a bit of a rogue. He actually used the wrong jury instructions intentionally.
Who is the judge?
Judge Sullivan. He is a judge. He's been overruled in every insider trading case since mine. And all of those persons have had their convictions vacated. He basically omitted an entire element of the crime in his jury instructions, and basically gave the government a lower hurdle to jump over in order to prosecute.
And I understand that the case was brought by Preet Bharara, who is now ex officio. So, what are your chances of getting your conviction overturned?
We have an appeal out there. It's as it gets farther and farther from the conviction, it gets tougher and tougher. And again, the criminal justice system, those who are familiar with it know that justice has very little to do with it. It's much more about winning and careerism versus truth and justice. So, both Preet as well as Judge Sullivan have acknowledged that the jury instructions they gave in my case were wrong, that an element of the crime was omitted, but rather than doing the right thing, which would be to vacate the conviction, they've sort of stuck to their guns and hung on to a procedural technicality and have not overruled.
Are you saying that you were not guilty of a crime, or you were not guilty of that crime?
I was not guilty of a crime and that crime. So, not guilty across the board.
Well, then, how did you title your book, Confessions of an Inside Trader?
It's not of an inside trader. It's of a Wall Street insider.
Okay.
But here again, we were talking earlier about the definition of insider trading, which seems to me to be gray as opposed to black and white. I mean, how is one to... In other words, if I get a stock tip that is fourth hand or fifth hand, does that constitute insider trading?
It could if it... Insider trading is really 4 or 5 elements. You have to have materiality, which means it's important. You have to have non-public, meaning the public doesn't know about it.
And won't have access to it.
Yes, and then it has to have been leaked or given in breach of a fiduciary duty or duty of confidence. And then all that has to be done and traded upon with knowledge. And there has to be a benefit exchange. So it's a lot of different things. And the interesting thing is it's never been defined. So Congress has never defined it. It's made up of a patchwork of judge-made law, almost a quilt. And as we've seen recently with, some of these cases that got overturned, a lot of the judges didn't even disagree on what the definition was. And it's not likely that Congress would ever define it. They, waited until 2012 to even pass a law that explicitly made them subject to the laws of insider trading. So they're not going to go back and define it. But you're right. It is black and white in many cases, but there's also a large gray area. And there's an excellent book out now called Black Edge that defines, hey, in some cases it's clearly black, meaning illegal. In many cases it's clearly white, but there's a massive gray. And, in our country, we typically don't take away someone's life or liberty based on either a misunderstanding or somebody that inadvertently steps over a line. You have to have knowledge. It has to be deliberate. There has to be intent. That's sort of the basis and the foundation of the criminal justice system.
Was your case based on gray or based on black or white?
With my partner, it was black. With me, it was gray. It wasn't even, remotely black. This was a guy who gave me 380 ideas I traded. He relayed to me on a telephone call, to buy the stock. Hey, I'm buying it.
We're gonna have to stop now. I'm sorry.
No worries.
But I want to continue when we get back with this train of thought. We're here with Michael Kimelman. This is Westchester Eye on the radio on WVOX, WVOX.com. This is a much shorter break, and we'll be right back with Michael Kimelman.
With world and national news, here is the latest update from Fox News Radio on 1460 WVOX.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lisa Lucera.
President Trump could not have chosen a better person. Mike Pence couldn't have chosen a better person. Paul Ryan, a county councilman, Republican in South Carolina, could not have chosen a better person.
South Carolina Republican Lindsey Graham, as the Senate Judiciary Committee votes 11-9 the long party lines to move the nomination of Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court forward. But the battle's far from over.
What we saw today was the position of the modern Democratic Party as they are opposed to Donald Trump appointing anyone to the Supreme Court.
Texas Senator Ted Cruz, Democrats have enough votes to block Gorsuch with a filibuster, but Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said they will use the so-called nuclear option, meaning they will change long-standing practice so a simple majority would get Judge Gorsuch confirmed. The State Department condemning this morning's attack at a subway station in Russia that killed at least 10 people. Fox News, we report, you decide.
In the north end of New Rochelle, you'll find an absolutely top-notch printer, one of the very best in the entire county. Frank Michelli's Minuteman Press is known for its fine work far beyond the Sound Shore area. In fact, this particular Minuteman Press is certainly the class of the fleet when it comes to full-service community printing. Located just off North Avenue in New Rochelle in the narrow Waikagill walkway across the parking lot from Acme, Frank Michelli's Minuteman Press is a terrific resource for individual and small to medium-sized companies.
The most powerful 500-watt radio station in America.
This station is now the ultimate power in the universe.
1460 WVOX.
WVOX. Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
And we are back, folks. Westchester Eye on the Radio. Peter Moses and myself. And our special
and
guest
no John
today,
Sharan.
And John Sharan is out today. We'll be back next week. But our special guest on the show today is Mike Kimelman, who has written a book called Confessions of a Wall Street Insider Trader. Mike was a Wall Street trader, and in 2009, he got that knock on the door. And the next thing you know, his life spun downwards. But now he's on an upward trend.
What kind of business are you doing now? I mean, if you have businesses all over the country, what are they?
So on the creative front, I just finished writing a sitcom pilot. I'm producing a documentary in the true crime space as well, which is pretty fascinating, about a New York iconic institution. As well as on the business side, I'm doing a lot of real estate investment, targeting opportunities for an investor group, mostly in the Southeast.
Did you come out of this with money still?
No. Walked out with the clothes on my back and a smile on my face, but that's about it.
And you've created, the people who you went into business with know your background.
Sure.
And went into business with you. Are these people that you had done business with before?
Some. Those who knew me have absolutely no qualms about going into business with me because they knew, I was a good guy and an honest guy and made people money. So those people I don't have any issues with. The people I've come across that are new people in new ventures, I'm very direct about it. It's better to get it out up front. If those people are uncomfortable and don't want to be in business, so be it. But there are a lot of fields like entertainment, which I think is especially forgiving. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to go work for Goldman Sachs or a Fortune 500 company, and that's, I'm not saying that's a tragedy, but some of the problems in our country with recidivism and everything else have to do with people coming out, served their time, so to speak, and have paid their debt back, but still carry that scarlet letter. So, on background applications, they can't rent an apartment, they can't get, food stamps or other things that are available, can't vote, can't carry a firearm. I mean, there are a whole host of, especially
and you're under that umbrella.
I am under that umbrella forever. I just got off probation, so I have a little more freedom. I don't have somebody that can arbitrarily say, hey, I don't like what you're doing. And in some cases, I held off doing certain things, like I'm consulting now for several cannabis companies in Colorado that are doing medicinal and therapeutic and great stuff in that space that are literally changing people's lives for the better on an everyday basis. That type of activity was prohibited to me, even though it had nothing to do with drugs. It wasn't, the marijuana or the THC part of a plant, but a probation officer could say, hey, I don't like what's going on. And the marshals would have been at my door to take me back to prison in 3 hours. So there were certain fields you had to avoid.
Which way? Now, how much of your prison experience, if there's anything positive that can be derived from that,
a lot,
carries over into your business expertise now? Were you able? What I'm saying, are you able to use any of your prison experience and apply that going forward to what you're doing now?
So it wasn't all negative. I'll be very frank about that, and that's not the case for everybody. It was for me.
It wasn't all negative?
No. There were things that happened in prison, like, getting sober. I was drinking to excess before I went in. Like figuring out what's important in my life and being truly grateful for the things that I did have, like 3 healthy children, amongst other things, as well as the people I met in prison that I think will be a blessing and that I wouldn't trade for anything in the long term.
Do you see money the same way now that you saw prior to going to prison?
No. I used to chase money, admittedly. I was in a field that, I'm a competitive guy. I liked the intellectual challenge of the markets and of trading, and that's how you keep score for that particular industry. It's like batting average or anything else. So
well, what do you do now? What do you do now to keep the dragon at bay?
I just don't need it. It's something, you see it, it's much more a tool that helps you live a life that you want to lead, but you don't chase it for the fact of chasing it.
Well, then what is driving you? Because you're obviously back to being a financial success.
No.
You're not living on food stamps.
Not living on food stamps. I'm nowhere near where I was. I mean, I probably had a piece of the business that I sold that valued my stake at, mid 8 figures. That was, a very valuable firm.
But you lost that.
Lost that all. But it's not what I seek anymore. We're all here for a fairly short period. I'd like to do something that has a little bit more of an impact than running a hedge fund. And again, it was always something I held off. And so, like many people, you say, hey, I'm going to do this for a couple more years. I'm going to make a little more money. And then I'm going to get into, big time philanthropy or charity or helping people or doing whatnot. And I always tried to help people. And we always did very, I think, positive things outside of the industry. But I was always consumed with getting bigger or better or making more money as well. Now I do what I need to do to pay the bills and try to build a little bit something extra for my children and whatnot. But
speaking of your children, how when you were in the 50 months that you were in prison, did your ex-wife ever allow them to come visit you?
She did. They came. My parents, knock on wood, the greatest people on the face of the earth, they would fly in from California, pick my kids up in New York, and make the 3 or 4 hour drive to Lewisburg to see me. So they were there every 6 weeks or so, and it's it's an amazing thing and a heartbreaking thing. Prison really hammers it home that it's not just the inmate or the defendant who suffers. Really, the entire family, the children, bear the brunt of that damage, which is a shame. And then there were isolated incidents at prison that really drive home how ridiculously punitive prison is, such as, on one visit, my parents did the route and came in, and I could see the kids walking to the visiting room and being in the visiting room, and then they announced over the loudspeaker that visiting was going to be canceled this weekend because an inmate had been caught smoking a cigarette. So Group punishment was a very big deal, but to, hurt kids, and it wasn't just my kids. I mean, there were plenty of other kids or wives or parents that were there because somebody smoked a cigarette is such a out of proportion and draconian punishment. And as I describe in the book, I could see my kids, from the yard where I was positioned, my vantage point, I could see them walking back to the car crying. And, to go through something like that gets seared on your brain. You don't forget that.
Now, having had that prison experience, obviously you were in prison with people that you didn't grow up with. What would you say is the common denominator in prison with people who come from all different classes?
That nobody wants to be there. Other than that, there's not a lot of common denominators, and that's what makes it interesting in some ways.
Did you take any friendships out of there?
I took a lot of them. So some of the projects I'm doing now in the documentary space and in the writing space came about through people I met while I was away. So there are, Italian guys who I'm very friendly with. I was very friendly with Kareem Biggs Burke, who was Jay-Z's former partner who I was there with, who's doing great things now in the clothing space, as well as probably another dozen or so people who I consider some of the best people I've ever met. There was a lot of people in prison who were terrible people too, and there was an even greater number of people who were mentally ill. And were being warehoused in prisons rather than receiving proper treatment. So it was a mixed bag.
But going forward, what would you teach your children about money and ambition?
That's a good question. I think the lesson that's most pertinent to the book that I really try to impart to them is that we're ultimately responsible for the people we surround ourselves with. So even though I don't believe I did anything wrong, didn't break a law, the partner that I went into business with absolutely did. And I tolerated him to some degree, and therefore I had to bear ownership of those consequences when it came back to haunt him.
Well, that's a big lesson, and one that resonates for people beyond the industry that you came from. I imagine it was a very humbling process also.
It was.
And we're going to be back to talk more about this with Michael Kimelman on WVOX, WVOX.com. This is Westchester Eye on the radio. If somebody wants to call in and ask Michael a question in the final quarter hour, the number here is 914-636-0110. And too bad there's no camera in here because Ardina, as usual, looks fantastic, as does Mr. Kimelman. I have a face for radio. And we'll be right back with my face from radio after these messages.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to Westchester Eye on the Radio. It's our final quarter hour with Mike Kimelman. We have a caller. Caller, can you identify your first name, please?
No, I can't, but because that would be gauche, and Republicans are never gauche. It's Mr. Kim from New Rochelle.
Mr. Kim, is this about this case? Is this about Michael Kimelman?
It will be. It'll be right on target.
But do it quickly because we only have a few minutes left.
Okay, well, thank you very much then for squeezing me in. As far as the prison system is concerned, is what this is about. This gentleman was innocent. We understand there are a lot of innocent people that are in jail, usually minorities. This gentleman, I don't think, would really qualify. But it was punitive, and he was treated, there was collective punishment, and so on. And he indicated the other prisons are violent, and the people are not protected from being molested, and so on. So
right, that's not new information. We just went over that.
Without any resources. So this induces people to go back to crime if they were doing it, or to maybe resort to it because they met criminals in prison. And I know that our recidivism rate is 75%, and the one figure I know about Europe is 7% recidivism in Norway. So don't you think we ought to be more careful about who we incarcerate and also treat them better when they get out so that they can be rehabilitated?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Kim. Why don't we let Mike answer that question? Thank you for calling in. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, the caller made some excellent points. I mean, the system itself should be scrapped. If not scrapped, There's a lot of changes that could be made. It's solely punitive right now, and there should be a punitive aspect to it. You broke the law, you deserve to be punished. But it can't solely be punishment. There has to be some rehabilitative aspect to it. Otherwise, like the caller mentioned, you'll come out. The post-prison system, whether it's the halfway house or probation or anything else, is a system that is designed to fail at its core. It's
not well thought out. It's not well funded.
There's nothing about it efficient, intelligent, or any way other. It's half the time it's for profit. So people want
not
that.
Lewisburg though.
Not Lewisburg, but some of the halfway house and whatnot. And there are for-profit prisons. They like the people coming back, and that's a sentiment you hear from the guards, from the administrators. Keep them dumb so they get right back in. When I was in prison, I went to the administration and asked to teach some classes on interviewing skills, resume skills, any type of post-prison re-entry skill set, and was denied flat out, and it was sort of
with explanation or without.
Well, the explanation was a laughing. What are you going to do? Teach them how to inside trade? They didn't want to do it anyway. But there's really no reason for there not to be more rehabilitative aspects to it. Again, it's a fortune to have 50 to 75% of people go back in within 3 to 5 years. It's expensive, it's dumb, it's unnecessary,
yes.
and it's inhuman in a lot of ways. And
speaking about in terms of stock, if I may, one of the fastest rising stocks are 2 prison stocks. I'm not going to give their ticket, their
sure.
phone, whatever you want, because I don't want to promote them. But one of them is, the last time I checked, was $36 a share. So that's an indication of how profitable prisons are.
Oh, no, they've made a fortune. And there was some sanity that was starting to return at the end of President Obama's term as far as getting rid of the for-profit aspect of it.
And but Trump's all in favor of that.
He is. And look, I'm one of those guys that thinks government does almost nothing well. There are certain things like the military that they do very well. Outside of that, the private sector does almost everything better. But there are certain rights that have to be protected as well in certain situations. And in this case, technology is so cheap these days. It would be so easy to put, I'm sure Dell would dedicate some computers from 5 years ago. Internet access is all but free. Khan Academy, Coursera, there are free online courses. Instead, you have people who go out and don't acquire any skills while they're there. They sleep, they watch TV, or whatever they do because they have no ability to improve themselves. They have no access to
education. But don't some prisoners go get a degree while they're in prison?
Very, very few, and the roadblocks that are involved are immense. And it's also expensive. I mean, you're talking about people who have no means whatsoever, and then they're going to go into debt to get a degree in something that literally, where I was, you could do that, and they would mail you forms or mail you some study sheets. Again, it's a delivery mechanism.
It's a half bogus.
It is. It's a delivery mechanism from the 1970s, and it's counterproductive.
So how do you walk away not feeling bitter and frustrated?
I mean, you could choose to be bitter or you could choose to be better. I chose to be better. I mean, I took something, and you hear it constantly in prison. There's a refrain that, everything happens for a reason. And I don't believe that, but I do believe everything that happens provides an opportunity if we have clear enough eyes and head to recognize that. Like I said, we're here for a very small time. So I got, in some ways, the opportunity to have an excess of time. In prison, there's a scarcity of everything, a scarcity of privacy, a scarcity of decency. The one thing that there is tremendous amount of is time. And that sometimes is the hardest part of it, but it does give you the ability to reflect on your life, on where you want to go, on what your priorities are, and to recalibrate if necessary. So that's what I did, and hopefully can make a positive difference in somebody's life.
Did you know ahead of time that you were going to be doing only 15 months?
I didn't. I was sentenced to 30 months. I was able to work the system, so to speak, in order to get my sentence reduced for good behavior, to be able to be eligible for time in a halfway house for 6 months. So I was able to take advantage of, being a model inmate to some degree to get my sentence cut down. And I ended up doing 21 months total in the federal prison system, but I was able to knock off 9 months. Yes.
Where in the Bronx?
Creston Avenue. up. Yep.
And Creston Avenue was one of the neighborhoods where they had huge drug gangs in the 80s into the early 90s. Creston Avenue had all these old, beautiful, from the outside buildings with sunken living rooms.
Art Deco buildings.
They weren't the Art Deco buildings that were down on Jerome Avenue by the stadium, but you were in the 180s, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the joke I make is the only thing worse than a Bronx halfway house is prison.
Right. But at least you had some okay Spanish restaurants or, Central America. Yeah,
edible.
They were edible.
It was better than prison in that you got to see real people and get back into the real world. And I'm using real in quotes. You can't really see me. But, the Bronx halfway house, which is supposed to be the cornerstone of the re-entry system, was as archaic and ridiculous as anything you can imagine. I mean, there was a payphone, and, you needed quarters for a payphone to try to call a potential employer, and let's say you were able to even get a hold of somebody, you don't have a computer.
They couldn't call you back either.
And they would call you back, and there would be either another inmate on the phone, so you're relying on inmates to take messages for you. And then even if you got through, you had to make an appointment. You had to clear an appointment like 48 hours in advance with the administration. If they didn't like it, they didn't like it, and you wouldn't go. So there was a guy who got out with me who was a chemical engineer and mechanical engineer, double engineer. And, for 6 months he sat there because there was no ability.
And what was he in prison for?
It sounded somewhat like a stretch, but there was an ATM electronic company, and again, it's hard to describe these things unless you've been there. But in this case, it sounded like the CEO had done some shady things, and
he got caught up in this.
Well, the CEO, when he realized it was going to unwind, went to the authorities and said, "Hey, this guy here was one of the guys who enabled it. I'll testify against him, and." So he gave up a couple people, and this guy was one of the people.
And you're still friends with this gentleman?
I don't stay in constant contact with him, but I consider him a friend. There was a wide variety of people there.
And very quickly, what's the next step for you?
I just keep, personally, I'm going to keep staying busy on the creative front. On the business front, I'm going to keep active. And then on the legal front, I'm going to continue with the appeal because I didn't get justice in that case. The judge as well as the U.S. attorney have admitted that. So I'm going to keep fighting to clear my name and keep moving forward.
Well, thanks for being on the show, Michael Kimelman. We have no parting gift, but I will tell you that I have interviewed in my life, and so has Ardina, hundreds of cons and ex-cons, and I've never heard a less bitter person who may have been wronged on a crime.
Buy the book, folks. Buy the book. Learn a lesson.
Yeah, but he's learned something, and he doesn't have any enmity to him, as far as I can tell, towards anything but the system, which in some cases might be rigged. And with the government we have right now, God knows where we're going to end up. Who do we have next week, Ardina?
Tune in next week. We have a wonderful guest, Abby Stein, who has left the Hasid culture, and Abby has transgendered.
Should be a fun week. Bye-bye, everybody.